Let's open our Bibles up to the book of Judges. We'll be continuing our study of the book of Old Testament history as we've looked at God brought Israel out of Egypt, turned them into a nation. We saw where they wandered in the wilderness for 40 years. We saw the problem of the unfaithfulness. And we looked in the book of Joshua where we saw how God gave them all the land. He brought them in, and what we saw in Joshua was a time period when, generally speaking, the Israelites were obedient. Now, there were a few exceptions to that where they made some mistakes or had some bad judgment calls, and they did things that were wrong. But generally, throughout the book of Joshua, we saw a nation of people that were obedient. They trusted God, and they went in and did exactly what He told them to do. But last week, we started the book of Judges, and we see kind of the opposite. As a general rule, they're disobedient, except for maybe a few times whenever they get it right. So we kind of see the opposite thing in Judges, really a low point in their history that spans multiple generations when they really don't live as God calls them to. And so we started looking at that. We looked at the first couple of chapters, and we got a little ways into chapter 3 last week, but we'll be picking up specifically at chapter 3 and verse 7 this week is where we'll be starting in just a minute. But throughout the book of Judges, we see something of a cycle where they're sinful, they disobey God, they go after other gods, and the Lord allows them to be oppressed by some other nations that are around them. And so they cry out to God in their distress. God raises up a judge that delivers them, and they're faithful for as long as that judge is around. And then it says that judge dies, and then the sons of Israel again do evil in the sight of the Lord. And you see that cycle that happens again and again and again throughout this book. And that's where we begin, is in chapter 3 and verse 7, at the beginning of another one of these cycles. The previous judge is now gone. And so we're going to get into that. But that's where we'll start this morning. Let's begin our class with a prayer, and then we will get into the text. Heavenly Father, we love you, and we are so thankful to you that we have the privilege of studying your word. Father, you've given us everything that we need for life and godliness through a knowledge of the truth. And Father, as we look at the history of your people in the Old Testament, Father, and we see both the good and the bad as we work our way through, Father, I pray that you would help us to learn the lessons that you want us to. Father, to learn the way that you take care of and bless your people when obedient, Father, and to see the way that, especially as we look at Judges, Father, the way that unfaithfulness causes all sorts of problems, Father, and it separates us from you. And Father, I pray that as we spend time looking at this book, I pray that it would help us to have a stronger faith in you and a determination to follow you more closely. Father, I pray that you would go with us through our time of study this morning, and pray that the things that we say and do would be just what you want. It's in Christ's name that I pray. Amen. So chapter 3 and verse 7, we have that common statement here at the beginning of our text. The sons of Israel did what was evil in the sight of the Lord, and forgot the Lord their God, and served the Baals and the Ashtaroth. The anger of the Lord was kindled against Israel, so that he sold them into the hands of Cushan-Rishathaim, king of Mesopotamia. The sons of Israel served him 8 years. And so we have the very beginning here of the next cycle. Now, I'll remind you as we get started with our discussion, we'll be going through looking at several of the judges this morning. If you've got a comment or question, Bill is in the back with another microphone. If you'll just raise your hand or let him know that you have a comment or a question. That way those who are watching online or those who will watch later can hear the entire discussion. But we see the Israelites, we see this cycle where there's no one to lead them in the right way, and so they do what's evil in the sight of the Lord. They go after other gods. The Israelites decided to serve other gods because they've been mixed with the nations. If you remember, right at the end of our class last week, we talked in this section at the beginning of chapter 3. Specifically, verses 5 and 6, the sons of Israel lived among the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites. They took their daughters for themselves as wives and gave their own daughters to their sons and served their gods. And so they're mixing with the nations that God has said, you don't mix with them, you don't make a covenant with them, you don't serve their gods, you don't intermarry with them. And the Israelites are doing exactly what God said not to do, and it's causing exactly what God said it would. Unfaithfulness. These people are drawing the Israelites away. But it says in this text in verses 7 and 8, they forgot the Lord. They're no longer keeping him and his works and his commands in their mind. They're no longer, it appears, obeying the command that God had given over in Deuteronomy chapter 6, where he talks about how they're to discuss his word all the time. They're to have these reminders around them, on themselves, on the doorposts of their house. They are to have reminders all around them of God and his word. And they either have neglected to have the reminders, or they're neglecting the reminders when they see them. They're not paying any attention to it because their minds are somewhere else. Their focus is somewhere else. They've allowed the people around them to draw them away from God. God is not their priority anymore, it seems. The idolaters have gradually stolen the hearts of these people from worshiping the Lord to worshiping these false gods. And the result is that the Lord kept his promise. He gave them into the hands of the king of Mesopotamia. In Deuteronomy chapter 28 and verse 25, God told them exactly what would happen if they went after other gods, if they mixed with the nations. Deuteronomy 28 and verse 25, the Lord shall cause you to be defeated before your enemies, and you will go out one way against them, but you will flee 7 ways before them. You will be an example of terror to all the kingdoms of the earth. And it's in the context of the covenant of blessing and cursing, where God has told them, if you obey me, here's all the ways I'll bless you. However, if you turn away from me, here's what's going to happen. And as he's telling them, if you disobey, this is one of the things he said, that you'll be defeated before your enemies. And that's exactly what we see happening here in the book of Judges. They've gone after other gods, and God says, okay, to the king of Mesopotamia, he brings the Mesopotamians in to oppress the Israelites. God's keeping his word. Even in the judgment, even in the punishment, we see God keeping his word. It says there in that text that he sold them into the hands of the king of Mesopotamia. They were sold, the imagery here is, or the language used is, he's selling them like they're slaves, and they're obeying the gods of these people. They're sold as slaves to the people by God, by the God that they've abandoned. Proverbs 14 and verse 34 says that righteousness exalts a nation, but sin is a disgrace to any people. And that's exactly what we see happening here, that they have forgotten God, and now they're serving this other nation and their gods. Then in verse 9, as we look at the way that this cycle works, we talk about the cycle of the judges. They're sold into the hands of this other nation. Verse 9, the sons of Israel cried out to the Lord, and the Lord raised up a deliverer for the sons of Israel to deliver them. Othniel, the son of Kenaz, Caleb's younger brother. The Spirit of the Lord came upon him, and he judged Israel, and he went out to war. And the Lord gave Cushan-Rishathaim, king of Mesopotamia, into his hand, so that he prevailed over him. Then the land had rest for 40 years, and Othniel, the son of Kenaz, died. And so here we have the first cycle that we see in this book specifically spelled out. They went after other gods. They were oppressed. They cried out to God, and a deliverer was raised up. And they have rest for some time. So when they came to their senses and noticed, they cried out to the Lord. The end of verse 8 says that they served the king of Mesopotamia for 8 years. It took them 8 years of servitude, 8 years of being under the control of another nation, under the control of another king, before they finally cried out to God. Sounds like they've been a bit stubborn. We want to do what we want to do. 8 years before they would cry out. And God raises up Othniel, that's Caleb's younger brother. You remember Caleb? What we see here is something of a faithful family. Because it wasn't just Caleb that was faithful in his family. We see his younger brother is the same type of individual. Someone who will trust God, someone who will lead people towards God. And the land had rest for 40 years. And so we have, as long as Othniel was over the Israelites, he was leading them in the right way. There's rest for 40 years. As long as the people are obeying God, or at least moving in the right direction, there's rest for 40 years. But the people didn't learn the lesson. Because as I mentioned, this is a cycle. It happens again and again. Because in verse 11 says that the land had rest for 40 years, and Othniel, the son of Kenaz, died. Verse 12, the sons of Israel again did what was evil in the sight of the Lord. So as soon as their leader, who's delivered them from the Mesopotamians, the one who's led them towards God, as soon as he's gone, they forgot what caused the problem. And they went right back into it. They again did evil in the sight of the Lord. So the Lord strengthened Eglon, the king of Moab, against Israel. So it was the Mesopotamians at first, now it's the Moabites. Because they had done evil in the sight of the Lord, and they gathered to himself the sons of Ammon and Amalek, and went and defeated Israel, and they possessed the city of the palm trees. And the sons of Israel served Eglon, king of Moab, for 18 years. And so you see the length of time that they're subjected to these foreign kings is growing longer. The first time it was 8 years. This time it's 18 years. They didn't learn the lesson. And you see, it appears that their stubbornness and their determination to do it the way that they want to do it is growing. The first time after 8 years, they cried out to God. This time after 8 years, verse 15 says, the sons of Israel cried out to the Lord. And the Lord raised up a deliverer for them, Ehud, the son of Gera, the Benjamite, a left-handed man. The sons of Israel sent tribute by him to Eglon, the king of Moab. And so God raises up a man who is left-handed, and that's going to be significant a little bit later in how he delivers Israel. But it's by him that they're sending tribute to this foreign king, the one who's taxing them. And so they send Ehud with their tribute. And so the judge here is going to get an opportunity to meet the oppressing king. And so that's important, the fact that he's left-handed and the fact that he's in the position that he is. And we get in verses 16 and following. It says, Ehud made himself a sword which had 2 edges, a cubit in length, and he bound it on his right thigh under his cloak. Now that's where his being left-handed makes sense, because it's going to be the opposite of what any enemy is going to expect. They're not going to be looking for a left-handed man. They're not going to be looking for a weapon in that particular spot. In the following verses, he presents the tribute, and he says, in verse 19, he himself turned back from the idols that were in Gilgal and said, I have a secret message for you, O king. He said, keep silence, and all who attended him left. And so this left-handed man who's bringing the tribute from Israel to this oppressing king, he comes to the king, and he's kind of, the idea is he's got a secret message. I've got a message for you. We got to send everybody away. And so the king gives him the opportunity to speak. Verse 20, Ehud came to him while he was sitting alone in the cool of his roof chamber. And he said, I have a message from God for you. And he arose from his seat. And Ehud stretched out his left hand, took the sword from his right thigh, and thrust it into his belly. And so Ehud claims to have a secret message from God, and well, there was a message that was delivered. God's not pleased with what's going on, but it wasn't in so many words. Everyone around is sent away so the message can be delivered privately. He stabbed the king with his sword so that the handle and everything went completely into the king of the Moabites. And Ehud left the king's chambers, closed the door, and locked the door behind him so that he had the chance to get away, and none of the Moabite king's servants knew anything was going on. And Ehud, the deliverer of Israel, walked right out without anyone knowing. And after he escaped, he went and blew the trumpet in the territory of Ephraim, and he gathered the armies, and in the battle that followed, 10,000 Moabites were killed. No one escaped. And this time it says that the resulting peace lasted 80 years. In verse 28, when we think about in this cycle of the judges, each time God raises someone up to deliver Israel. Remember Othniel, the first one, Caleb's younger brother, someone who was faithful. Notice in verse 28 in chapter 3, notice the kind of man that Ehud is. He said to them, "Pursue them. The Lord has given your enemies, the Moabites, into your hands." So they went down after him and seized the fords of the Jordan opposite Moab and did not allow anyone to cross. What do you notice about the way that Ehud speaks here about the battle? Is there anything that strikes you about the kind of man that he is? He gave credit to God. He didn't talk about the strength of the Israelites. We've got them now. The Lord has given them into our hands. When God raises someone up, it's someone that puts faith in him, that gives credit to him. And so you see the kind of mindset that this judge has. So we see from the family connections and the type of man that Othniel was, now we see Ehud giving credit to God. He's not saying, because I've been such a good leader, because I went in and took out the king. This is God's doing. And so it tells us something of the mindset of this individual. It shows the kind of people that God raises up. It's those who trust him rather than themselves. And then in verse 31, we have just a very short one verse about the next judge that God raises up. After him came Shamgar, the son of Anath, who struck down 600 Philistines with an ox goad, and he also saved Israel. Just think about one guy who kills 600 of the enemies with an ox goad. Just let that image sink in for just a minute. Because if he had a conventional weapon, that's a really tough guy. But what he's using is a piece of farm equipment, not a conventional weapon of war. There's one author that writes that when God goes to war, he usually chooses the most unlikely soldiers, hands them the most unusual weapons, and accomplishes through them the most unpredictable results. Once again, we see the power of God is on display. Because this isn't the type of warrior that we would expect. But this is someone that God raised up, and it demonstrates his power. And so we've seen now this cycle in chapter 3 has happened a few times. But then we move into chapter 4, and we see that the Israelites are pretty stubborn. They don't learn their lesson very quickly, because chapter 4 and verse 1 says, "The sons of Israel again did evil in the sight of the Lord." And there's going to be that recurring theme all the way through the book. They're delivered, they have peace, and then when the judge is gone, they forget all about it, and they go right back into idolatry. Their evil began this time after the previous judges are gone. When the one leading them towards the Lord died, they go back to their sinful ways. And what that tells us is that they're following, rather than following God, they're following after this judge. They're following after this man. And as soon as that man is gone, they forget the Lord. It's not because they have a strong relationship with God that they're doing right necessarily for all those years. They're following someone who does. Their trust is misplaced. And as we go through the book of Judges, one of the things that we see is the problem of putting trust in a man rather than trust in God. Because in every case, God raises up a judge, or that judge may do an incredible job, but he's only there for at most a few decades. and he's gone. Men are temporary. Men make mistakes. If you're putting trust in a man rather than in God, sooner or later it's going to lead to some major problems. And that's what we see happening again and again throughout Judges. And we see this as a problem throughout history. You see it here in Judges as they'll follow after the judge, and then after the judge is gone, they go after other gods. The Corinthian church struggled with putting faith or putting their emphasis on men. In 1 Corinthians chapter 1, Paul was dealing with the division. Some of you say, I follow Paul, some Apollos, some Peter, some Christ. There was the division. There were many of them putting their trust in their favorite messenger rather than in the one that they follow. The sons of Israel again did what was evil in the sight of the Lord, chapter 4 and verse 1, after Ehud died. And the Lord sold them into the hand of Jabin, king of Canaan, who reigned in Hazor. And the commander of his army was Sisera, Sisera. And so we have him, the Israelites again being sold like slaves into the hand of another foreign king because they've gone after other gods. And so we have that same imagery coming up yet again. They're sold as slaves to serve a pagan king. They're serving their gods. Remember Romans chapter 6 and verse 16, Paul said, you're slaves of the one that you obey. They've been obeying these foreign gods. They've been serving these foreign gods, and so they're sold as slaves to the people that serve the foreign gods. Because that's who they've been obeying. It's who they've been following. Or as Jesus said in John 8 and 34, everyone who commits a sin is the slave of sin. God sold them into the hand of their oppressors. We have the same phrase, that same concept comes up yet again in verse 3. The sons of Israel cried out to the Lord. Over and over. They do evil. They're sold into the hands of their enemies. And now they're crying out to God. They cry out to God because they're not able to do anything about the oppressors themselves. They've been oppressed severely for 20 years. Here it took 20 years for the nation as a whole to come to their senses and to turn to the Lord. And what we see throughout Judges is a nation that appears to be more concerned with the consequences of their sin than concerned about their sin. Because it's only after they've been oppressed for 8 years, and then 18 years, and then 20 years, that they decide maybe we ought to talk to God about this. It's more akin to, at least what it appears, is that they're sorry they got caught. They're sorry they're having to deal with the consequences. And so they cry out to God. The sons of Israel cried out to the Lord in verse 3. God answers their prayer in verses 4 down through 10. It tells us that Deborah was judging Israel at the time, and that all of this was going on, and she sent for Barak to deliver a message from the Lord to him. And so in verses 6 and 7, she sent and summoned Barak, the son of Abinoam, and she said to him, behold, the Lord, the God of Israel, has commanded, go and march to Mount Tabor and take with you 10,000 men from the sons of Naphtali and from the sons of Zebulun. And I will draw out to you Sisera, the commander of Jabin's army, with his chariots and his many troops to the river Kishon, and I will give them into your hand. And so the Israelites have cried out to God yet again, and God says, okay, here is a deliverer. Barak is summoned, and he agrees to go, but only if Deborah will go with him. And so he goes out, and he calls the 10,000 troops, and the Lord keeps his word. The Lord wins the battle for Barak over Sisera. But I want you to notice in verses 12 through 16, they told Sisera that Barak, the son of Abinoam, had gone up to Mount Tabor, and Sisera called together all his chariots 900 iron chariots, and all the people who were with him. Deborah said to Barak, "Arise, for this is the day which the Lord has given Sisera into your hands. Behold, the Lord has gone out before you." So Barak went down from Mount Tabor with 10,000 men following him. And the Lord routed Sisera and all his chariots and all his army with the edge of the sword before Barak. And Sisera alighted from his chariot and fled on foot. Barak pursued the chariots and the army as far as, so he pursues them. And the army of Sisera, it says, all the army of Sisera fell by the edge of the sword. Not even one was left. So Sisera has these 900 iron chariots, and God gives them into his hand. But I want to call your attention back to Judges chapter 1, because there's an interesting relation that we have here. In chapter 1 and verse 19, the Lord was with Judah, and they took possession of the hill country, but they could not drive out the inhabitants of the valley because they had iron chariots. Now over here, the iron chariots weren't a problem. What changed? What's the difference? Why were the iron chariots such a problem in chapter 1 for the people of Judah? They were trying to do it themselves over in chapter 1. But here in chapter 4, they're relying on God. God has given these people, has given them into their hand. It has to do with who they're trusting. It reminds me of over in Numbers chapters 13 and 14, whenever God has told the Israelites to go in and take the land, and the 12 spies go in and the 10 of them come back and say, "They're too big, we can't do it." It all had to do with the focus. Who are they putting their faith in? In chapter 1, the iron chariots were a terrible problem they couldn't overcome. But when you have a leader who's trusting in God rather than in themselves, the iron chariots are not a problem at all. Because God has the power to take down whatever fortifications, whatever weapons, whatever enemies. The difference is in where we put our trust. We think about the mission that we have. We're involved in a spiritual war. And if we think that it's all up to us, that we have to be good enough, we have to be smart enough, we have to be powerful enough, we have to get everything right, then we're in trouble. The Lord wants us to share the love of Christ, preach the gospel to all the nations. But if we look at it and say that it's up to our ability, we're in trouble. But if we trust in the promise of God, he says in Matthew chapter 28 and verse 20, "I am with you." Are we trusting in him for our strength, or are we trusting in ourselves? That's what God's always wanted for his people, is that we put our trust in him. That's what he wanted over here. It's what he wants today, that we trust in him. Verses 17 and following, we have the death of Sisera. He fled on foot from the battle. He fled to Jael's tent. And Heber's wife was there because of a peace that was between them, and she went out and invited him into her tent and offered to hide him. She covered him with a rug, brought him something to drink, and he told her, "Stand at the door, and if anyone asks you if I'm in here, tell them no, you haven't seen me." She waited until he fell asleep and drove a tent peg through his head, and she went to meet Barak whenever he came, who was pursuing Sisera, and showed him, "He's already dead. Here's the one you're seeking." In chapter 5, we have the song of Deborah and Barak praising God. And at the very end of chapter 5, the land was undisturbed for 40 years. And yet again, we see the stubborn nature of people. Because in chapter 6, there's that verse again, that repeated phrase, that repeated concept that comes up. They did the same thing. The sons of Israel again did what was evil in the sight of the Lord. And the Lord gave them into the hands of Midian 7 years. And so now they've done it yet again, and God brings in, there have been the Moabites and there have been the Mesopotamians. Now there's the Midianites. God brings another one in to oppress them because they've chosen to serve other gods now instead. And here's where we get into the account of one of the judges that's a bit longer than most, but also teaches us some incredible lessons about what God expects, about what's really important. They did what was evil in the sight of the Lord, and the Lord gave them into the hands of Midian 7 years. The power of Midian prevailed against Israel. Because of Midian, the sons of Israel made themselves the dens which are in the mountains, and the caves and the strongholds. For it was when Israel had sown, the Midianites would come up, and the Amalekites and the sons of the east, and go against them. They would camp against them and destroy the produce of the earth as far as Gaza, and leave no sustenance in Israel, as well as no sheep, ox, or donkey. For they would come up with their livestock and their tents, and they would come in like locusts for number, but they and their camels were innumerable. They came into the land to devastate it. Israel was brought very low because of Midian, and the sons of Israel cried to the Lord. There it happens again. They're brought down. They're humbled because of their bad decision, because they've done evil. Maybe we ought to cry out to God again. When everything goes wrong, they turn to God, but when everything goes right, they go everywhere else. Maybe we ought to cry out to God again because they've been brought down. They've been under the oppression of Midian for 7 years. The produce is destroyed. Their land is devastated. And so far, up to this point, whenever we've read that phrase, the sons of Israel cried out to the Lord, what has God done? Every time, what has God done? He delivers them. They sin and they get the consequences of their actions, so they pray and God says, okay, and he delivers them, but it's a little different this time. He does deliver them, but he doesn't start there. Verse 7, it came about when the sons of Israel cried to the Lord on account of Midian. The Lord sent a prophet to the sons of Israel and said to them, thus says the Lord, the God of Israel, it was I who brought you up from Egypt and brought you out of the house of slavery. I delivered you from the hands of the Egyptians and from the hands of all your oppressors, and dispossessed them before you and gave you their land. And I said to you, I am the Lord your God. You shall not fear the gods of the Amorites in whose land you live, but you have not obeyed me. So far, God has responded by raising up judges to deliver them. But what did God do different this time? Before he raises the judge up, he sends them a message. He gives them a very clear message about why they are in such a terrible position. You have not obeyed me. They have again and again gone after foreign gods, and when they cry out yet again to God, he sends them a prophet that says, why don't you think about why you're in such a position? Take a look back at your history. Who's the one who's given you everything that you have? Why do you have this land anyway? He charges them to think about why they're there, the reason for all of it. And then in the following verses, he begins the process of raising up a judge to deliver them. But this time he sends them a message first. Think about why you're here. In verses 11 down to verse 24, we have the call of Gideon, or the commission of Gideon. The Lord commissions him and promises to be with him. In verse 11, you see the angel of the Lord came and sat under the oak, which is an Orpha, which belongs to Joash the Abiezrite, as his son Gideon was beating out wheat in the winepress in order to save it from the Midianites. There's a picture of bravery. He's hiding from the enemies. He's beating out wheat in the winepress. It shows how the people have been humbled before their enemies and something of the fear that they have of their oppressors. In verse 13, in this conversation, verse 12, the angel of the Lord appears and says to him, the Lord's with you, O valiant warrior, to this guy who's hiding. And notice Gideon's response here. Who God raises up turns out to be someone who's very faithful, someone who's willing to listen. But he starts off very fearful and doesn't exactly have the response you would think of somebody who's really faithful, at least at the beginning. You see someone who's been beat down, someone who's upset about the situation. In verse 13, Gideon said to him, O Lord, if the Lord's with us, why has all this happened to us? Where are his miracles, which our fathers told us about, saying, didn't the Lord bring us up from Egypt? But now the Lord has abandoned us and given us into the hand of Midian. And so you see the thinking of the people, the Lord has abandoned us. The prophet that had been sent to Israel before had a very different message. Who abandoned who? The Israelites had abandoned God, and so they've been given over. But Gideon's response here tells more of the thinking of the people. They're not recognizing their sin. They're not recognizing that they've abandoned God and that they're not being faithful. They just look at it and go, God, where'd you go? The Lord has abandoned us. He goes on, Gideon mentions, my family is the least in our tribe. I'm the least in my family. And he talks about, the same type thing when God raises up other. You remember when God raised up Moses? Who am I to do this? Gideon kind of goes through a similar type of a questioning there, or not really a questioning, but a similar type of conversation where I'm the weakest, I'm the least. But whenever God raises someone up to do something great, he often uses the one who's the weakest, the one who is the very least, the one that no one would expect, because it leaves no uncertainty about where the power came from. A little bit later on, it'll be next week before we get into it for time, but whenever Gideon brings the army together, God makes sure that the people are not going to get credit for defeating the Midianites. Because even though there's over 100,000 of the Midianites, Gideon brings together 32,000 troops to begin with. Less than a third. And God says to him, you have too many. I can't win with this many. Send some of them home. And so Gideon sends some of them home. They're left with 10,000. And God says, you still got too many. God raises up the least and the weakest in order to make very clear whose power is doing the saving, whose power is winning this victory. Gideon lacks the confidence, but God builds him up, and he gives him. We'll touch on this again next week, but I want to end on this because this is so important, so foundational to what Gideon is told. I want to take a look in verses 25 and following. It says, on the same night the Lord said to him, take your father's bull and a second bull, 7 years old, and pull down the altar of Baal which belongs to your father, and cut down the Asherah that's beside it. Build an altar to the Lord your God on top of this stronghold in an orderly manner, and take a second bull and offer a burnt offering with the wood of the Asherah which you've cut down. God builds Gideon up to the point that he's ready. Gideon's going to start doing what God has said. And the commission that God gives him is not go amass an army. It's not a battle plan about how to get rid of the Midianites. The command that God gives him is something very different. Why is this so important? Why not just start with the battle plan and get rid of the Midianites? After all, the people have started crying out to God. What's so significant about what God tells him to do in verses 25 and 26? I'm sorry? Okay, he's got to clean his own house first. Why else is this so important to delivering Israel from their oppressors? What relation does this have to the oppression that they're needing deliverance from? It's the cause. You can't get rid of the consequence of sin until you get rid of the sin itself. This is what's underlying it. God tells Gideon, if you're going to deliver the Israelites, if you're going to deliver your people from the Midianites, you got to get rid of the idolatry that caused it. You got to solve the problem before you can get rid of the consequences or the effect. The Midianites are not the root problem. That's just the ones that God has allowed to come in because of the problem. This is the root problem. Get rid of the idolatry and serve God. Before he could go to war with the Midianites, he had to go to war with sin. He had to get rid of the root cause of it. So often we want things that go wrong in our lives. We want it to be fixed. We want to see things get better. Often whenever things aren't going like I want them to, or things aren't going like I think they ought to, whenever I really take a close look, it's because of some poor decision that I've made. The problem has to be dealt with. The root cause has to be dealt with first. Then the consequence can be gotten rid of. And that's where we're going to pick up next week, is looking at Gideon's actions and getting rid of idolatry, and then we'll see the way that God uses Gideon to deliver the Israelites from the oppressors. We've got just 1 or 2 minutes before we dismiss. Are there any comments or questions before we finish up this morning? If not, let's bow and conclude with prayer. Heavenly Father, we love you and we thank you for the time that we've had to look into your word. And Father, as we've begun to study the account of Gideon, Father, and the way that you raised him up to save your people from oppression, Father, I pray that we would understand the more important battle that he fought was the one in getting rid of the false religion and the idolatry, Father, and fighting against sin in his own house and his own life. And Father, I pray that we would recognize the connection that has to us, Father, that the first thing we need to do is we seek to solve problems that we see around us and in our own lives, that we would take a close look and examine our own selves, Father, to get rid of the sin and the things that we do sometimes that don't please you. And Father, I pray that we would first seek to be transformed in the likeness of Christ in following after you, Father. And Father, I pray that as we continue to spend time together this morning to worship you and to praise you, Father, and to look more into your word, Father, I pray that everything we say and do would be just what you want. It's in Jesus' name that I pray. Amen.